worthless, giant Apache woman was given to a mountain man. As payment, his response stunned everyone. That's what the townsfolk said. She was taller than any man, strong as a wagon ox, and silent as a stone. Traded like livestock to a man who lived alone atop Widow's Peak, a man known more for burying trespassers than showing mercy. Folks whispered she was cursed. Others said she weren't even fully human. But when he took her in, something strange happened. The cabin that once echoed with silence began to hum with life. Was she truly worthless? Or had the world been too blind to see her worth? And what kind of man accepts a human being as payment, only to treat her with dignity? In a land where cruelty was common and kindness rare, one man's choice lit a fire that would change a whole town forever. When a woman is cast aside and a man answers with honor, it's more than a tale. It's a reminder of what still matters. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, who truly saw her and who looked away? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories still speak to something deep in us all. If you believe that dignity, kindness, and quiet strength still have a place in this world, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and subscribe to help keep these frontier parables alive. They brought her at dawn, when the frost still clung to the ground like a final warning. 5 men on horseback, hard-eyed and hollow-bellied, rode up the crooked trail that led to Widow's Peak, dragging behind them a silent figure, tied by a length of frayed rope. She walked barefoot over the stones, her face unreadable, her long black hair knotted and dull. Her shoulders were wide, her gait slow and steady, and her frame seemed carved from something older than the land itself. The men behind her spat and muttered, one of them laughing cruelly as they neared the weather-beaten cabin nestled against the rock face. "Hope you like your payment big and dumb," one of them called out. Elijah Dorsey stepped from the shadows of the porch. He was a tall man, gaunt but still broad in the shoulders, with a beard that fell to his chest and eyes like burnt coals. He didn't greet them, didn't wave, didn't reach for the rifle propped by the door. He simply looked at them with that blank, unsettling stare that had earned him his reputation in every saloon and trading post from Cotton Bend to Red Bluff. Folks called him many things: Mule of Death, Widow's Ghost, the Bear Killer, but none called him friend. "She's what we got," the lead settler said, his voice tight with shame, disguised as spite. "Owed you 6 fox pelts and a musket. You won't get better." He tugged at the rope, making the woman stumble slightly. "She don't talk much, don't listen much either, eats like a mule, sleeps on her feet, can haul logs, kill a pig with her bare hands if she's not moon-eyed." Elijah's gaze dropped to the woman. She was perhaps 20, perhaps older. Her bare arms were streaked with mud, but her skin was unscarred. Her eyes, though downcast, were steady, not fearful, not blank. Just quiet. A thick bracelet of rawhide bound her wrist. A charm dangling from it. She smelled of smoke and wet earth. One of the men chuckled bitterly. "No need to thank us. She ain't worth a handshake, but she's yours now. Consider the debt closed." Elijah didn't answer. He stepped forward, took out his knife, and in one slow, deliberate motion, sliced through the rope. The woman didn't flinch. The cut ends fell away like dried vines. Without so much as a glance at the men, Elijah turned and walked toward the cabin door. The woman hesitated only for a moment. Then she followed, silent as snowfall. Behind them, the settlers stared, baffled. "He's lost what was left of his mind," one whispered. "Reckon she'll snap his neck by morning," said another. But Elijah didn't look back, and the woman didn't stop. Inside, the cabin was dim and spare. A fire glowed low in the hearth. A single chair, a pot of beans on the coals. Elijah didn't speak. He took his seat, tore a piece of bread in half, placed one half on the table, and waited. She stood near the door, unsure. Then slowly she sat on the floor, legs folded beneath her, hands resting on her knees like still water. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a whisper. And just like that, the strangest rumor ever to circle Widow's Peak began to take root. A girl given away like kindling, a man who didn't speak, a silence between them, heavy as iron and just as binding. Elijah Dorsey hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another living soul in 5 years. He kept to his routines like clockwork, rising before the sun, boiling coffee strong enough to peel bark, checking his snares, splitting firewood in clean mechanical swings. No dog barked at his heel, no laughter echoed off the trees, no woman's voice warmed the porch. Only the whistle of wind through the tall pines and the crackle of the hearth kept him company. Some nights he sat staring at the fire with a piece of blue cloth in his hands. A baby's blanket, edges frayed, the stitching almost worn away. He never cried. He never drank. He just sat, silent, watching the flames curl. Widow's Peak was no easy climb, and the trail up was cruel to the weak-willed. That's why he built there. The mountain watched over him the way he wished God had watched over his wife or his little girl. But that was a long time ago. Too long to change. The Apache girl, though he didn't call her that, had followed him into the cabin without a sound. She stood for a moment, her back against the closed door, arms at her side like she wasn't sure if this was shelter or another kind of cage. Elijah hadn't said a word. He didn't motion, didn't explain. He simply sat down, tore the bread in two, ate his piece slowly. When she didn't move, didn't touch hers, he said nothing. That night, after stoking the fire and sliding the bolt into place, he laid down on the cot, one blanket for warmth, one beneath him for softness, and the blue one, hers, folded and placed under his hand. The girl hadn't asked for a place to sleep. She just stepped outside and sat on the woodpile beneath the overhang, back pressed to the logs, arms crossed over her knees. Her eyes stayed open all night. The rain started before sunrise, a slow, soft patter that turned the ash trail to muck and bent the pine boughs low. Elijah rose and dressed like always, opened the door and saw her still there, soaked to the bone, unmoving. Her hair hung like a wet curtain down her shoulders, and her dress clung to her legs. She didn't look at him. He stood there a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, deep and old. Without a word, he stepped back inside, fetched a wool blanket from the chest, and walked it out to her. He didn't hand it to her. He tossed it, not unkindly, into her lap. She looked at it, then up at him. Her expression didn't change, but her hands moved slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. That was all. Elijah went back inside. He didn't expect gratitude. He wasn't offering kindness. At least that's what he told himself. But that day he left the door unbolted. Not open, not wide, just unbolted. By noon the fire needed more wood. He opened the door again to fetch it and saw the girl standing near the woodpile, gathering sticks into a neat bundle. She moved slowly, methodically, as though every action had weight. She did not speak. She did not look at him. She simply brought the wood to the porch and set it down in a perfect stack. Elijah stared at it a long time after she'd returned to her corner under the awning. That night she sat a little closer to the doorway, and when the wind howled like ghosts through the trees, Elijah didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he found himself listening to her breath, even and calm, to the silence, no longer quite so heavy. Snow fell like sifted flour from a sky the color of pewter. It coated the pines in white lace, hushed the woods into stillness, and buried the trail to town in drifts as tall as a saddle. Elijah Dorsey stood at the window, a chipped tin mug of bitter coffee in hand, and watched the girl, no, the woman, lift the axe once, then again. Her movements were not graceful, but neither were they clumsy. There was a rhythm to them. Each swing split the frozen log with a clean crack. She worked in silence, her breath misting in the cold, the wool blanket he'd given her now fashioned into a crude shawl. Her feet were wrapped in rags and leather strips she'd found in the shed, enough to keep the frostbite back. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. In the mornings, she rose before him, water already boiled when he came into the main room. In the evenings, she fed the chickens, shoveled paths, swept snow from the stoop. He noticed things, how she checked the traps and always released the smaller catches, how she never took more than her half of a shared meal, how she left a small stone beside the fire each night, always a different color. Ritual, memory. He didn't ask. Once, he watched as she gently rubbed ointment onto the cracked udders of an old nanny goat that hadn't produced milk in 3 winters. The goat didn't kick or fuss, just stood there, still and calm under her touch. The same goat had butted Elijah into the snow the last time he tried to pen her. That night, he gave the girl his daughter's old boots, stiff with time but better than rags. He left them by the hearth without a word. The next morning they were gone, and she wore them when she hauled water. Her name came by accident. He heard her humming once, barely a whisper of melody as she stirred a pot of stew. A low, sad tune, not from these mountains. He didn't recognize it, but it gripped something in him. After a pause, he said quietly, "That song got a name?" She didn't look at him, but her lips moved. Nita. He wasn't sure if she meant the song or herself, but the way she said it, soft and sure, left no question in his mind. After that, he began thinking of her as Nita. Nita did not chatter, did not smile, but she worked, harder than any man he'd hired in years past, and she never asked for rest. Sometimes after supper, she would sit by the window and draw shapes in the fog glass. Mountains, stars, birds. He never commented, just watched. Elijah found himself leaving the fire lit longer at night. He chopped extra wood before she could. He cleared a space on the bookshelf and found an old tin of charcoal pencils, placing it beside a blank ledger. They did not speak, but something lived in the silence now, something warmer than words. He began to notice her eyes more, how they didn't flinch, how they always seemed to be searching for something just beyond sight. She had the look of someone who had lost more than she'd been allowed to grieve. Elijah knew that look. He saw it every morning in the mirror, in the sag of his shoulders, in the weight he carried without ever touching. Snow fell. Days passed. The wind howled through the timberline, and the silence between them grew full, not of loneliness, but of something almost like understanding. In the smoky warmth of the general store, over mugs of weak coffee and the rattle of dice on a barrel lid, the townsfolk stirred the pot of gossip with eager spoons. Word had trickled down like melted snow. Elijah Dorsey was harboring something strange up on Widow's Peak. A woman, an Apache woman, not just any, tall as a barn beam and strong as 2 men. Some said she'd been given to him like a dog to guard his cabin. Others claimed he'd taken her as a wife, a savage bride in a savage place. There were darker whispers, too, about witchcraft, curses, the cries of beasts heard in the wind. A few claimed they saw unnatural lights on the mountain. None dared go up to check. Inside the apothecary, Miss Hester sat quietly, winding a spool of blue thread. She listened without blinking as a miner spat tobacco and muttered, "That ain't right. Giving a man a woman like she's meat." Another chuckled, "Bet she eats raw squirrels and sleeps hanging from the rafters." The room roared with laughter. Miss Hester stood slowly. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and sharp as a pine needle. "You don't know what you're speaking of," she said, "and you'd be wise to hush before the mountains hear you." The laughter died. They all remembered Miss Hester had birthed half the town and buried the other half. When she spoke, it wasn't just words. It was judgment. Up on Widow's Peak, the fire crackled low in the hearth. A storm had rolled in quick that afternoon, slapping snow sideways against the windows and howling down the chimney like a banshee. Elijah had gone out early to check the trap line. A foolish thing in this weather, but habits didn't break easy. He returned limping, blood soaking through his glove. Nita saw him stagger, and before he could brush past her, she reached out and gently took his hand. He tried to pull back, out of instinct, but she held fast. Not hard, not rough, just firm, like a memory refusing to be forgotten. She led him to the table and unwrapped the glove. A deep gash cut through his palm, a spring trap sprung wrong. Without a word, she brought water, salve, and cloth. Her hands were rough, but her touch was careful. She cleaned the wound, eyes focused, movement slow. Elijah flinched once when she poured the whiskey to cleanse it. She didn't react, just tied the bandage tight and stepped away. He muttered, "Thanks," almost to the floor. That night the cabin was quieter than usual. The storm had passed, but the cold remained. Elijah sat in his usual chair, nursing his wrapped hand, eyes half closed. Across from him, Nita sat cross-legged near the fire, rocking slowly on the worn rug. In her hands, she held a strip of embroidered cloth, delicate, faded, edges singed. It was his daughter's sash, the one she wore the winter she fell through the ice. He hadn't seen it in years. Nita didn't ask permission. She simply cradled it like something sacred, her eyes distant. Elijah opened his mouth to speak but found no words. He watched her, the way she rocked, the way her fingers traced the threads. She wasn't stealing it. She wasn't disrespecting it. She was remembering something. Maybe her own loss, maybe his. He didn't take it from her, didn't scold or question. He just let the fire burn and listened to the creak of floorboards beneath her weight. Something heavy and old shifted between them, not gone, but no longer alone. Elijah woke with a cry stuck in his throat, fists clenched in the rough quilt, sweat soaking through the linen at his back. The fire in the hearth had died down to coals, but the shadows on the walls still danced like they had a story to tell. His breath came hard, ragged, and he sat there in the dark for a long while, listening to the wind gnawing at the shutters. In the dream, he had been back on the riverbank, the sound of cracking ice, the sudden absence of his daughter's laughter, the stillness that followed. It never left him. It just waited for him to sleep. He rose, pulled on his coat with stiff fingers, and stepped outside into the brittle morning air. The snow was soft with new fall, a powdery layer atop old crust. His breath rose in clouds as he made his way toward the tree line, but he paused when he saw her. Nita was kneeling in the snow beside a shallow hole. Her hands were red with blood, not her own. A small rabbit, stiff and twisted, lay on a square of linen beside her, its legs snapped clean in a trap she had set the day before. Elijah remembered her marking that line carefully, choosing the spot with quiet care. She had wanted to prove she could do it. Her strength had always been obvious. But this was something else, an attempt at craft. She had checked it before dawn, it seemed, found the creature still alive, bleeding, dying slow. He stood watching her from a distance as she dug the hole, not with tools but with her bare hands. She wrapped the rabbit carefully, reverently, and placed it in the earth. The snow around her knees had melted into wet circles from her heat and tears. She didn't see him, or maybe she did and didn't care. Her shoulders trembled, though no sound came, and when she pressed the last scoop of snow over the grave, she sat back on her heels and covered her face. It was the first time Elijah had seen her break. He went back inside. That night, after a quiet supper, with the air heavy between them, he sat by the fire and stared into it for a long time. Nita sat across from him, her face turned toward the flames, the lines of it soft in the glow. He cleared his throat. "She died giving birth," he said. "My wife, Clara, wasn't even 30. His voice cracked. Told her I'd be back in 3 days, went to get sugar and nails, and she bled out while I was gone. The baby, my girl, she lived. For a while, sweetest thing, used to hum to the birds. Nita looked at him, not moving, but not cold either. Just open. She was 5, Elijah continued. Went out playing too close to the river. Ice wasn't thick yet. I was trading pelts with the railroad boys in Mason Ridge. Came back to nothing but silence and frozen footprints. He didn't cry. He just stared at the hearth, voice low and rough as gravel. I thought if I stayed up here long enough, maybe the world would forget me. Maybe I'd forget me. Nita didn't speak, but her gaze didn't waver. He nodded once and stood. That's all, he said, and turned in for the night. Come morning, the air was thick with frost. The fire had been stoked already, and on the hearth where the kindling usually sat, stood a small wooden figure, carved with care. A girl, hair braided, arms outstretched as if ready to catch snowflakes. It wasn't beautiful, but it was careful, thoughtful. Elijah stared at it a long time. Then he reached for his coat, left the carving where it was, and stepped into the snow without a word. The winter began to loosen its grip. Slowly, a little more sunlight each day, a little less wind slicing through the trees. Snow still blanketed the mountain, but water trickled beneath it now, streams waking from a long sleep. The silence of Widow's Peak no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like waiting, like breath held between heartbeats. Nita moved through that silence like she belonged to it. She spoke no words, yet her presence filled the cabin with a kind of quiet intention. Where once Elijah had seen only muscle and muteness, he now saw something else, an attentiveness, a grace buried under the weight of years spent being misunderstood. He found her one morning kneeling in the woods not far from the shed, beside a young deer. Its leg was twisted, broken by a fall, maybe a wolf's chase. The animal kicked weakly in the snow, eyes wide with panic. Nita whispered nothing, but her hands worked calmly. She had gathered a strip of torn cloth, some willow twigs, and a bit of bark. She bound the leg with patience, gently brushing the creature's neck. The deer breathed heavy, then still. When she was done, she let it go. It limped into the trees, unsteady but alive. Elijah watched from the edge of the clearing, unseen, or perhaps not. She never turned to look at him, but he sensed she knew. Later that week, his cough returned. Cold nights and damp boots had riled it up again. It clawed at his chest like dry straw. One morning he found a steaming mug waiting on the table. It smelled of bitter roots and pine. He sniffed it warily, then drank. It burned his throat and cleared it. She didn't say a word, just nodded once when she saw the empty cup. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cared if he breathed easier. Each day, the rhythm between them grew stronger. Nita swept the floors before he could. She gathered herbs in silence, sorted them by type, dried them on linen cloths she'd found in the trunk. She fed the hens before sunrise. Elijah carved a second stool for her, rough, sturdy, unspoken. And then came the stew, a thick, savory thing made from rabbit, turnip, and bone broth. They ate it together by the fire, the logs popping softly as night folded around the cabin. Elijah cleared his throat, pushed his bowl aside. He looked at her, really looked. You had chances, he said. Could have run, could have vanished into the woods. Why didn't you? Nita's spoon paused midair. She looked down, then up. Her eyes held no fear, just an old sadness that had grown patient. Because you didn't chain me, she said. It was the first time he'd heard her voice since she'd given her name. Soft, low, steady, like the river under ice. He didn't answer right away. His throat tightened, unbidden. He blinked, once, twice. She looked down, blinking too. The fire snapped between them. Neither said another word that night. But the next morning, Elijah made coffee for two. The snow began to melt in long, reluctant sheets, sliding from the cabin's roof like winter finally letting go. The path down to the well turned from crunch to mud, and the trees shook off their frost like old men stretching stiff limbs. In the clearing, sunlight came through in weak, golden slivers, and the stillness of Widow's Peak softened into something warmer. It was one morning after the thaw had begun when Elijah said it. He had been splitting kindling when he glanced over his shoulder, sweat on his brow, and saw her, barefoot in the slush, hair pulled back, crouched low to examine a patch of stubborn green poking up through the earth. Not a weed, not yet a flower, but alive. She touched it like it mattered. "Miss Nita," he called, his voice low and rough, "you might want to leave that be. Could be poison ivy yet." She looked up, blinked. The name Miss Nita hung in the air like a bell that had never been rung. She didn't smile, but her eyes held something new, something warm. She didn't correct him, didn't shake her head or look away. She simply nodded once, and that was enough. That night, Elijah pulled a battered ledger from the bottom of a trunk. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked. Alongside it, he placed a pencil. He didn't hand them to her, just left them on the table near the window where she sat after supper. The next morning, the pages were no longer blank, not with words but drawings. Simple at first, a crooked pine, a squirrel with wide eyes, a mountain slope and curved lines. As the days passed, more appeared, a wildflower pressed in between pages, a pair of children holding hands, a woman with braids seated by a fire. Elijah flipped through them when she wasn't looking. His hand paused over one, his cabin drawn in rough but loving detail, smoke curling from the chimney, and two figures standing outside. One tall, bearded, one strong with a shawl. He set the book back gently. He realized then, she remembered in pictures. Her voice might be quiet, her words sparse, but her memory was loud. She had seen everything. She carried it with her. Together, they began to patch the place up. The broken window above the kitchen table was repaired with a new pane, cut from a salvaged crate and sealed with pine sap. A bench was built under the oak tree, where Elijah caught her sketching in the afternoons. They cleared a patch of ground behind the shed, pulling weeds and scattering seeds. Beans, squash, corn. She marked the rows with small stones. He built a low fence around it, though no creature had yet dared test her presence. Then one afternoon, a familiar voice called from the trail, "Elijah Dorsey, you best not be dead up there." Miss Hester arrived with a satchel full of herbs and questions. She hadn't been up Widow's Peak since the autumn. When she stepped through the cabin door, she paused. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of stew and cedar. The floor was swept, the hearth well kept. And there, seated by the window, was Nita, sketching a bird from memory, her braid looped over one shoulder. Miss Hester didn't speak right away. She looked at Elijah, then at Nita, then at the walls where new carvings had been hung, flowers, animals, small wooden figurines. "Well," she said after a long breath, "this ain't what I expected." Elijah shrugged. "It ain't what I expected neither." Miss Hester sat. She didn't ask the usual questions, just listened. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, not howling anymore, just passing through. Silas Vaughn arrived in a cloud of dust and arrogance, his boots polished too fine for the mud-caked streets of Hollow Creek. He rode in on a black gelding, trailed by a wagon with iron boxes and men who didn't smile. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but not the smug twist of his mouth. Folks stepped aside when he passed, not out of respect, but caution. Everyone had heard the name. Vaughn of the Iron Crescent Line, a man who laid rail through mountain and memory alike. A man who didn't ask permission, just offered terms, then sent men with rifles if those terms weren't met. He wasn't in town an hour before sitting across from Mayor Halder in the back room of the saloon. The mayor, a soft-bodied man who'd once taught school before politics turned him slippery, poured 2 glasses of whiskey hand trembling just enough to be noticed. Silas didn't touch his. "I hear tell," he began, laying out a map marked with red lines and inked curves. "There's a peak west of here, high, clear, and untouched, perfect for a rail spur. My engineers say if we cut through there, we save a month of labor and 3 bridges." Halder nodded slowly. "You mean Widow's Peak? That's the one. There's someone living up there," the mayor said, voice cautious. Silas smiled. "I've been told. Some wild man and the gift he was given." He said it like a joke, like a dirty one. The mayor didn't laugh. "Squatters," Silas added with a shrug. "The law don't protect squatters. Not when the land falls under lapsed treaty grounds." Halder blinked. "Treaty?" Silas pulled out a rolled parchment. "An old agreement between the government and the Apache. The land was set aside but never properly claimed. There's a clause, you see, says if the tribe doesn't maintain presence, the territory reverts to federal ownership. And once that happens, well, let's just say my company has friends in Washington." "And the girl?" Silas leaned in. "What girl?" Halder swallowed. Silas sat back, tapping the rim of his untouched whiskey. "I'm offering the town a deal. We buy out the surrounding properties at above market rates. Bring work, bring freight, progress. All I ask is silence about the man on the mountain. Let the wheels turn. And if he doesn't leave," Silas smiled thinly, "then the land will be cleared one way or another. Fire's common up there, isn't it? Dry trees, windy nights." The mayor didn't respond. By nightfall, the rumors had begun. Men drinking at the saloon spoke in low tones of new money, of tracks laid across the west, of Hollow Creek becoming a hub. A few remembered the names etched into the war memorial outside the church. Apache raids, settler reprisals, a history soaked in blood. And atop the mountain, under a starlit sky, Elijah sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Nita sketched quietly beside the fire, unaware that men in polished boots and hollow promises had begun to speak of their home like it was just a line on a map. The wind shifted that night. A scent of smoke carried in from somewhere distant, though no fires burned. Not yet. The whisper reached Miss Hester in the back of the church while she was tending the flower vases. 2 men talking low over hymnals and sawdust, unaware she was within earshot. They spoke of land deals, federal surveys, and a line of iron teeth cutting straight through Widow's Peak. One said Silas Vaughn was already calling in surveyors from St. Louis. The other muttered something about the mountain being cleared out soon, and both men laughed with the nervous cheer of those who knew better but followed money all the same. Miss Hester didn't hesitate. She left the flowers half-trimmed and rode her mule up the winding trail before nightfall, the wind pulling tears from her eyes and the air tasting of something unfinished. When she reached the cabin, she dismounted stiffly. Elijah was out back, sharpening an axe. He didn't look surprised to see her. "They're coming," she said. He didn't stop. The rasp of stone against steel continued, steady and slow. "I heard," he said. "They want to take the peak. They want to take everything." "Let 'em come." It wasn't defiance in his voice, not exactly. It was something heavier, like stone that had settled too deep to be moved. Miss Hester didn't argue. She knew the shape of his grief. She also knew there was something worth saving up here. Inside, Nita had already sensed the shift. She'd watched Elijah listen to Miss Hester's news with that quiet tension in his shoulders. That night, while he sat silently at the fire, she knelt near the hearth, pulling up the loose board beneath the iron poker stand. He glanced over but said nothing. She reached deep into the hollow beneath the floor. What she pulled out was wrapped in oilskin and brittle with age. Papers, dozens. Some cracked at the edges, others still legible. She spread them across the floor. Elijah leaned forward, a flicker of recognition lighting behind his eyes. Among the papers was an old treaty, handwritten, signed with both government seal and tribal markings. One symbol caught Nita's eye. She pointed to it with trembling fingers. "My grandfather's," she said. The mark was simple, a circle with a line through it, like a setting sun. Elijah touched it with care, his brow furrowed. "I remember this," he muttered. "This land, it was set aside. They called it worthless, too high for cattle, too rough for farming. But the Apache knew better. This was sacred, burial land." Nita reached for the notebook, flipping to a clean page. Her pencil moved quickly. She drew the ridge lines. The old stream before it dried, the oak grove near the cliffs, the marked stones by the ravine, burial mounds, prayer trees, places long forgotten by the town, but not by her. When she was done, she handed the map to Elijah. Her eyes said more than her mouth could. This land had memory, and now it had proof. Elijah stared at the paper, then at her. "We don't run," he said. Nita shook her head once. That night he sat at the table, sharpening his hunting knife, organizing the treaty papers, re-inking faded names, quietly, methodically, as though preparing not for war, but for truth, for reckoning. Outside, the wind carried the smell of iron and distant fire. Inside, the mountain remembered. The fire came at night, just as the wind picked up from the east and the pines began their slow, uneasy groaning. Nita was the first to smell it, not wood smoke from their hearth, but sharp, wild, hungry. She opened the door and stepped into the dark, her eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Orange flickered through the black, far off but spreading fast. Sparks leapt skyward like angry spirits. Then came the sound, branches snapping underfoot, distant shouting, and the low roar of flame licking through dry underbrush. "Elijah!" she called, voice calm but edged with urgency. He was already reaching for his rifle. The woods lit up faster than either of them expected. Hired men, 5 by Nita's count, moved through the trees with torches and shovels, setting fire to brush piles and dousing roots with oil. They wore kerchiefs over their faces and carried revolvers at their hips. Not lawmen, not neighbors, strangers. Elijah fired once into the air. "This is Dorsey land," he shouted. "Come any closer, you'll meet the same end as your fire." A figure broke through the trees, a broad man with a shovel raised high. He lunged for the cabin's porch where Nita stood. She moved without thinking, grabbing a rusted hoe from beside the door. Their weapons clanged, then broke apart. The man swung again, but she dodged, seized the shovel's handle, and twisted it from his grip. He staggered, stunned by her strength, but before he could react, she slammed the flat of the hoe against his chest. He dropped hard into the snow. Behind her, a shot cracked. Elijah grunted and dropped to a knee, clutching his shoulder. Blood spread quick and hot through his sleeve. He didn't cry out, just bit down and kept his eyes forward. Another thug appeared, revolver raised, but Nita was already running. She hurled the shovel through the air. It hit the man's hand with a sickening thud. The gun dropped. The fire drew closer. Nita rushed to Elijah, pulled him back into the cabin. Smoke began curling beneath the eaves. She doused a wool blanket in water and beat back embers, landing on the roof while Elijah crawled to the hearth and loaded the second rifle. They fought the flames and the fear until dawn. By morning, the fire was dying. The thugs vanished into the trees, one left behind. He was tied to a pine with rope from Elijah's old sled, hands bound behind his back, eyes wide and red-rimmed. A note hung from his neck on a torn piece of burlap. 4 words painted in Nita's steady hand. "This land remembers you." When the townsfolk found him, they weren't sure what to make of it. The mayor turned pale. The blacksmith laughed once, low and grim. Miss Hester, who had heard the commotion and smelled the smoke, stood before the gathered crowd at midday with her boots still muddy. "This isn't progress," she said, her voice cutting through the muttering. This is robbery, plain and filthy. You burn a man's woods to lay track over the bones of his dead? That's not building something. It's tearing something sacred down. She looked around at faces that had long pretended not to care. How much more before they come for your land? Your kin? The silence afterward was thick. No one had answers. Up on the peak, Elijah's arm throbbed, bandaged tight. Nita stood at the window, eyes still on the smoke curling from the trees, jaw set like stone. Something had changed. The mountain was no longer quiet. It had found its voice. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge the next morning, word of the fire had reached Hollow Creek like a spark in dry grass. No one had to fan it. The tale twisted through saloon doors, schoolhouse benches, and feed shop counters faster than any telegram. But for once, the story wasn't about a savage or a hermit. It was about something else, something harder to define. They said a girl, not a woman, not an Apache, but a girl, had fought off a grown man with nothing but a shovel. Said she'd carried Elijah Dorsey half a mile back to his cabin after he'd been shot, and then doused a roof fire with her own hands, smoke in her eyes and steam rising off her shawl. Said she'd stared down a gang of armed men without raising her voice. Some added flourishes, flames parting for her, bullets missing by divine will. But at the heart of it all was the same whisper. She had stayed. She had protected. And Elijah, that ghost of Widow's Peak, the one who hadn't been seen at Sunday service since Lincoln's second term, had fired into the sky not for land or gold, but for a girl who wasn't his blood, a girl he hadn't asked for, a girl he'd made room for anyway. The preacher, Reverend Miles, stood up in front of the modest Sunday crowd that week and told a different kind of sermon. He reminded the room that when the flood came down from the northern hills 10 years back, and horses were swept from their barns, it was Elijah Dorsey who'd lashed a rope around his waist and walked chest deep into the current to haul out the Miller boy. No one had spoken to him after, but no one had stepped forward first either. We judged him for his silence, the Reverend said, but forgot what he did when it counted. At the schoolhouse, Miss Fairley, who taught letters and civics, shared what she'd seen last winter, how a tall girl with quiet eyes left bundles of dried corn and jerky near the edge of the slum quarters where some of the miners' widows scraped by. No name, no asking, just food, left when no one watched. She remembered the shape of the figure, now unmistakable in hindsight. By the end of the week, even the blacksmith, who once joked Elijah had ice instead of blood, admitted that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the man than loss and shadows. Takes guts to stand when everyone else kneels, he told a customer as he hammered out horseshoes. Takes more to care when nobody asks you to. A slow wind shifted through Hollow Creek. Folks who'd once been quick to believe Silas Vaughn's promises now looked sideways at his men, all polished boots and empty eyes. Progress was still on their lips, but it had lost some of its shine. They began to ask harder questions. Why Widow's Peak? Why now? Why were papers drawn up before the fire had even cooled? The town had awakened, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't blink or look away. It looked up the mountain, toward the cabin nestled in the pines, and saw not a recluse and a beast, but a man and a girl, standing guard over something the town had nearly forgotten. Decency. Miss Hester didn't believe in waiting for storms to pass. She believed in meeting them head-on, with boots laced and sleeves rolled. 2 days after the fire, with the smoke still clinging to the trees and the scent of ash riding the breeze, she hitched her mule and rode into town like a thundercloud. Her gray braid was tied tight, her eyes sharper than a whetstone. She went first to the church and found Reverend Miles polishing the brass candlesticks. "You still believe in justice, or just preach about it on Sundays?" she asked. Without a word, he set down the cloth and followed her. Next, she stopped at the smithy, where Elias Kemp pounded iron into shape. "You know metal," she said. "Know how to bend it, But can you hold a line when someone tries to break what's good? He wiped his brow and nodded once. The saloon keeper, too, was summoned, Jude Crandall, a man more used to pouring whiskey than signing petitions. But even he knew when something foul had crawled into town wearing the face of progress. In the back room of the general store, they spread out the old treaty Nita had uncovered. Miss Hester tapped the worn ink with a firm finger. "This mark," she said, pointing to the circle with the line through it, "is Apache, her grandfather's. It holds weight even now." Reverend Miles read through the wording, slow and careful. "Land set aside in perpetuity," he said, "as long as blood tied to this soil still breathes." "That girl breathes," Miss Hester said, "and she remembers." They drafted a letter, formal and fire-tempered, to a federal judge 3 counties over known for siding with fairness over favors. They signed their names beneath it like a prayer, sealing it with the town's crest and their own reputations. A rider was sent before dusk. Back on Widow's Peak, the air had turned still again. The kind of still that follows fire, not out of peace, but pause. Elijah sat on the porch, arms still wrapped from the gunshot, whittling a piece of cedar into a shape that hadn't declared itself yet. Nita sat on the step below, her sketchbook resting against her knees. She looked up, eyes searching for words. "I dream sometimes," she said, voice slow, broken in grammar but whole in meaning. "Of place, small, wood walls, garden, no shouting, no rope, just fire in corner. Maybe goat." Elijah looked at her. "You mean like a home?" She nodded. "Home. Not big, but warm. Not many words, just safe." He set down the carving and leaned back, eyes turned toward the tree line. "Sounds like heaven," he said, the words tasting like something long forgotten. She didn't reply, just turned a page and began to draw. 2 figures beneath a cabin roof, surrounded by trees that stood like guardians. One held a lantern, the other, a book. Below, in rough block letters, she wrote one word: safe. And though Elijah didn't say it aloud, something inside him whispered back the same word. For her, for them, for the land that had never asked for war, but remembered every kindness like a seed waiting to bloom. The town hall had never held so many bodies at once. Folks stood shoulder to shoulder, boots tracking mud across pine floors, breath steaming in the cold air that slipped through the cracks in the window panes. Even the children were quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. Outside, horses stamped and snorted. Men from both sides waited with rifles slung and nerves wound tight. Silas Vaughn arrived late, as if by design, flanked by 2 stone-faced guards dressed in black. He wore a long coat of buffalo hide, his gloves clean, his boots polished. He walked with the slow, smug stride of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. In his hands, rolled and bound with ribbon, was a deed freshly inked, bearing stamps from offices 3 counties away. He held it like a weapon. "Let's make this quick," he said, voice cutting through the low murmur. "The land in question has been declared abandoned by both the government and surviving tribes. My claim is legal. This," he held up the deed with a flick of his wrist, "is proof." He turned to the mayor, who stood near the front, sweat already beating at his collar. But Silas hadn't reckoned with Miss Hester. She stepped forward, her spine straight, her eyes burning with the kind of fire that didn't flicker. In her arms, wrapped in linen and sealed with wax, she carried the original treaty, preserved through time, hidden in floorboards, resurrected by hands that remembered. "This is the real proof," she said, unwrapping the document and laying it flat on the table before the crowd. "Signed in 1834, ratified by both federal and tribal leaders. It declares Widow's Peak as preserved land, not open for purchase, not for clearing, and not for men who torch forests in the night." There was a rustle in the crowd, then stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open again, and the room turned. In walked a man caked in trail dust, beard thick with road grit. His badge glinted at his chest, the federal judge they had written to, come 3 days early and on horseback, without entourage or announcement. He stepped to the table, eyes scanning both documents. Silas stiffened. The judge spoke without looking up. One is forged, sloppy work, the seal's wrong, and the ink's too fresh. He placed a firm hand on the old treaty, nodding once. This one's real. Then he turned to Nita, who stood near the back, her face unreadable, hands clasped before her. The room seemed to lean toward her. This land, the judge said, voice quiet but heavy, is not for sale. It's home. For one long breath, no one moved. Then Silas slammed his palm against the table. "You fools," he shouted, eyes wild. "You're throwing away a future for a ghost and a savage." He reached for the forged deed, but two deputies stepped forward. One grabbed his wrist, the other unholstered his revolver. Vaughn fought, but only for a moment. The crowd parted as they dragged him out, charged with fraud, attempted arson, and conspiracy to commit violence on sovereign soil. No one clapped, no one cheered. But as the doors closed behind him, a quiet peace settled over the room. Nita looked to Elijah, who stood near the window, his arm still in a sling. He gave a slow nod. Justice hadn't come with banners or speeches. It had come on horseback, bearing truth, and left with lies and chains. The rain came early that spring, soft and steady, soaking the earth in a way that felt less like a storm and more like forgiveness. It fell for 3 days without pause, drumming gentle rhythms against the cabin roof, filling the low ditches and swelling the creek beds that had run dry for too long. Elijah stood on the porch beneath the overhang, his sling now faded and loose, the ache in his arm dull but persistent. Beside him stood Nita, her shawl damp at the shoulders, her eyes turned toward the trees where smoke once curled, but now only mist hung like lace between the branches. Below the ridge, townsfolk moved like ants along the trail, hauling lumber, clearing brush, dragging stones from the footpaths. Children skipped in puddles. A pair of oxen pulled a small wagon of tools up the muddy slope. These were not the men who had come with torches, nor the ones who once muttered rumors over whiskey glasses. These were neighbors now, if not yet friends, folk with calloused hands and quiet shame, eager to mend what had nearly been lost. Elijah had not asked for their help, but he hadn't turned it away either. Reverend Miles stood near the edge of the woods where the oldest trees grew. In his hand, he held a newly carved cedar post, smooth and warm with fresh oil. Nita had etched symbols along its edges, small sunbursts, a spiral river, and below it, a line of tiny circles marked with ashes. It was a tribute to the lives that had once walked this land, Apache names long unspoken, spirits once exiled, now honored. The preacher set the marker into the earth with the help of two farmhands, then bowed his head. "For those who were here before us," he said, "and for the ones still watching, may we earn your peace." No sermon followed. None was needed. Later that day, Elijah knelt in the soft soil behind the cabin, seeds in one hand, a small trowel in the other. The bandage on his shoulder tugged when he reached forward, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was still here, still working. Rows of corn would go here, he decided. Beans along the fence. He remembered how Clara used to hum while planting, how their daughter once scattered seeds like bird feed, laughing when they landed in crooked lines. He heard quiet footsteps behind him. Nita approached, her notebook open, rain still clinging to her lashes. She crouched beside him and turned the page. On it was a drawing, clear, clean, full of light. A small cabin, not unlike their own, but larger. A second room built off the side, windows with flower boxes, a fenced garden, and near the back, a simple wooden structure with benches inside, a schoolroom. Children drawn as stick figures, some sitting, some reading, some laughing. Beneath it, in her careful hand, were two words: someday home. Elijah looked at the picture for a long time, the breath catching in his throat. Then he nodded once, slow and sure. The rain continued to fall, softening the earth, waking old roots, and giving birth to something the mountain hadn't seen in a long while: hope. Spring crept in slow, like a guest unsure it was welcome. The mountain thawed one layer at a time, and with each patch of green that cracked through the mud, a little more color returned to the world. The garden behind the cabin became the heart of it all, a patch of earth once hardened by frost, now softened by care. Shoots of corn reached skyward like promises. Beans climbed their twine with patient ambition. Squash blossoms opened in the morning sun, yellow and trembling. Elijah stood with a pail in one hand and a hoe in the other, watching Nita pluck weeds with a grace he hadn't expected. She moved in slow arcs, humming under her breath, her braid trailing over one shoulder. There was peace in her now, not loud or showy, but deep and steady, like the roots beneath their feet. One morning he brought out two fishing poles, simple rods of smooth pine, string wound around their handles, hooks dull from disuse. "We'll go down to the bend," he said. "Water's higher now. They'll be biting." Nita followed him in silence but not in distance. She walked beside him, not behind. At the riverbank, Elijah showed her how to tie the hook, how to watch the float, how to feel the line tense in the fingers before a catch. Her hands were quick, her eyes focused. When she caught her first trout, she lifted it with quiet pride, not celebration. Elijah chuckled and clapped once. She gave him a sidelong glance, a faint curl at the corner of her mouth. Later, while the fish sizzled over the fire, she opened her notebook and pointed to a sketch she'd made of him, sitting on the bank, head tilted slightly, eyes closed. She touched her chest and said, "You here with this? Not just here," she added, tapping his ear. Elijah stared at her, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "Been listening to wind and water for years. Forgot how to listen to people." She tapped the drawing again and smiled. "You listen now." That evening they read together. An old primer from the trunk, its corners curled and stained with time. Elijah sounded out the words. Nita followed with her finger, mouthing them softly. She laughed when he misread one, and he didn't mind. It was the kind of laugh that healed things. In the days that followed, Elijah carved something. A slab of cedar he sanded smooth each evening. Nita watched, curious but didn't ask. When it was done, he hung it above the cabin door with two nails, crooked but firm. The words were simple, carved deep. "This cabin is watched by two." Nita stood beneath it, reading slowly. Then she looked at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped foot on the mountain, she smiled. Not shyly, not out of politeness, not forced. It was a full smile, wide and open, the kind that reshaped a face from the inside out. It was not a smile of fear, it was a smile of belonging, and Elijah, seeing it, felt something old and heavy inside him finally settle into place. The earth had softened enough by late spring that the trail to the ridge behind the cabin no longer crackled underfoot. It gave slightly with each step, damp from the night's rain, rich with new life pushing up in delicate greens. Elijah walked slowly, each stride heavier than usual, not from age but from memory. Beside him, Nita moved with quiet purpose, something small and wrapped in cloth held close to her chest. They reached the little rise just as the sun broke through the clouds. There, under a birch tree that leaned slightly east from a lifetime of mountain wind, sat a simple grave, marked with a wooden cross Elijah had carved years ago, when his hands still shook from grief. Time had worn the edges smooth. The name, Anna Dorsey, remained faint but legible, carved with care. Below it, the year she was born, and the year she was lost. Elijah removed his hat. Nita knelt, unwrapping the bundle she carried. Inside was a carved figurine, small, no taller than a man's hand. A girl with long braids, a dress that flared as if caught in a twirl, and bare feet pressed together like she was dancing. It was simple but lovingly done, each curve smoothed by days of quiet work. Nita placed it gently at the base of the cross, brushing away a few fallen birch leaves. She would have liked that, Elijah said softly, his voice steady but low, as though speaking too loud might wake the sorrow buried with the bones. Nita stood and looked at him. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. His palm was rough, hers calloused, but their fingers fit. "You saved me, you know," he said after a long silence. Nita didn't answer right away. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them like whispers too faint to catch. "You gave me a name," she finally replied, her voice quiet but certain. He turned to look at her. Her eyes were not wet, but they held the weight of tears long wept. Not just for herself, but for others. For children like Anna, who never grew old. For mothers who bled too soon. For fathers who buried their hearts in soil. They stood there until the light shifted and the sun touched the tips of the birch leaves, casting a dappled glow over the grave and the two figures beside it. That night, Elijah didn't dream of ice cracking or the silence that followed. He dreamed of laughter, his daughters, light and tumbling, chasing the wind. He dreamed of Clara humming a lullaby in the kitchen, flour dust in her hair. He dreamed of Nita dancing barefoot on the porch, the carved figurine in her hand. And though he still felt the ache of what he lost, the ghost that once gripped him with cold fingers had grown quieter. Not gone, but gentled, like old wounds beneath calloused skin. For the first time in years, Elijah Dorsey slept without guilt pressing on his chest. And outside the cabin, under a sky heavy with stars, the mountain kept watch. The days grew longer, and the trees wore their brightest greens, swaying softly in the highland breeze like old friends speaking in low tones. Spring had passed its baton to early summer, and with it came a new kind of quiet. No longer the silence of pain or retreat, but the stillness of contentment, of things growing unseen beneath the surface. Nita spent her mornings in the garden and her afternoons at the window with a pencil gripped tightly, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, a sheet of paper smudged beneath her hand. She was learning to write. It had started with names. Nita, first, again and again in shaky lines. Then Elijah. Then words like home, sky, and safe. Elijah sat beside her some nights with an old spelling primer, reading aloud as she copied the letters slowly, tracing the shapes until her fingers grew confident. He never rushed her, never corrected her harshly, just sat near and waited, nodding when she got it right, smiling when she beamed at a full line unbroken. But the words that filled her pages weren't just exercises. They were stories, letters really. Not sent to any one person, but written as if to anyone who might need them. "My name is Nita," one began in careful looping script. "I was not born a monster. I was made to feel like one. But the mountain saw me. It knew I was still whole, even when I felt small." Another read, "There is a place where no one speaks if they don't want to, where silence isn't punishment, where the wind brings stories instead of fear." Elijah read them in the evenings, quietly, when Nita was out tending to the hens or sketching in the garden. He never told her when a letter made him cry, but he did something else. He built her a desk. He found a slab of maple deep in the woods, the grains smooth and pale, carved the legs himself, fitted them with care, even oiled the surface so her paper would glide. No nails were visible. Every joint was tight, shaped by hands that had known loss and had learned to build again. He placed it by the window where the morning light came in best. When she found it, she ran her fingers across the surface like it was something sacred. For your word, he said simply. She nodded, eyes shining. That week, she began placing the letters in glass bottles, old canning jars, sealed tight with wax and wrapped in scraps of fabric. She wrote in both Apache and English, the two languages curling around one another like vines on a trellis. At the river's edge, she would kneel and let them go, one by one, watching as the current carried them downstream, bound for places she'd never see, to hands she'd never hold. Each bottle drifted out like a truth whispered into the wide, waiting world. I hope someone reads me, she said one evening, watching the last jar disappear beyond a bend. Elijah, standing beside her, touched her shoulder gently. They will, he said, and in the wind that brushed past them, soft and steady, it felt like the mountain agreed. The years passed with quiet grace, like wind shaping stone. Seasons came and went, each leaving its mark in soft wrinkles around Elijah's eyes and a deeper calm in Nita's gaze. Widow's Peak, once whispered of in fear and shaded with tales of ghosts and gunfire, became something else entirely, a place spoken of in reverence, its name wrapped in warmth instead of warning. Travelers came first out of curiosity, a trapper looking for shelter, a widow with 3 sons, seeking work in safe ground. Then came more, an orphan girl from a railroad town, a wounded veteran who'd lost more than just a limb, a teacher worn thin by city life. They came for different reasons, but each left with the same story. That atop the mountain, there was a cabin where sorrow did not rule, and people were not judged by what had been done to them. Nita welcomed them all. She had grown into herself, tall and steady as the trees that ring the clearing. Her strength was still there. She could lift a support beam over her shoulder without flinching, but it was the gentleness in her hands that stayed with people. The way she taught a boy to hold a paintbrush with wonder, or how she traced shapes into a girl's palm to teach her the alphabet. She spoke more now, not often, but with meaning. When she smiled, it lit the room. Elijah walked slower these days. His knees ached in the cold, and his hands sometimes trembled when he carved. But he still rose before dawn, still made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, still tended the garden when the sun was just a smear of orange over the treetops. He spoke more too, in his own way, telling stories to the children by the fire, passing down wisdom shaped by silence and years. The cabin changed piece by piece. New walls were added, the old roof replaced by one of thick cedar shingles. A porch wrapped around it now, with benches where strangers turned family sat in the evenings. Inside, the hearth still burned, the same stones at its base, the same warmth spilling into every corner. Above the mantel hung a sign, carved long ago by Elijah's own hand, sanded smooth by time. No one is worthless here. Visitors often paused to read it, eyes lingering. Some would trace the letters, a few would cry. Nita never explained it. She didn't need to. One evening, as the sky faded to deep violet and stars began their slow climb, Elijah sat in his chair by the fire, a blanket draped over his knees. Nita sat nearby, sketching the face of a sleeping child cradled in a wool shawl. Elijah looked at her, his voice quiet. This place used to be all ghosts. Nita looked up, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. Now it's full of stories, she said. He nodded, the lines of his face softening into something like peace. Outside, the pines swayed in rhythm, and the mountain stood, unchanged and yet utterly transformed, watching over a cabin where lost things were found, broken things mended, and where every soul, no matter how wounded, was seen.